It was an ordinary Sunday morning in the small American town of Mayfield. As always, the local residents gathered in the old stone church, which stood on the main square for more than a century. People here knew each other from childhood, and any news was passed by word of mouth before it appeared in the local newspaper. Pastor Thomas led the service as usual, but this day was not like any other. At 10 o'clock in the morning, when all the parishioners were already seated, a woman broke into the church, all in tears and with terror in her eyes. It was Anna, the wife of a respected local businessman, Richard Walker. She screamed that her husband had been killed. Residents of the town were shocked. Richard Walker was one of the richest and most powerful men in Mayfield. He was respected for the fact that he actively supported local charitable initiatives and sincerely attended church services. The local police quickly arrived at the scene of the crime, which happened to be the Walker home, located just a few blocks from the church. But what they saw was shocking, even for experienced detectives. Richard's body lay in his study, and next to him on the floor was written in blood the phrase, "For your sins." The murder of Walker immediately brought the whole city to its feet. The police started an investigation, but the locals started spreading rumors. Some talked about jealousy, others hinted at secret debts or disputes. However, no one could have imagined that the truth they would discover would be so dark. The first days of the investigation did not yield any results, but within a week, secrets that had been hidden for decades began to emerge. The investigation into the death of Richard Walker was gaining momentum. The police interrogated everyone who could have at least some connection with the deceased. The whole town seemed to be suspicious. Wife Anna, who was shocked on the first day, now behaved discreetly and avoided journalists. Something suspicious appeared in her behavior, but no one could say what exactly. Detective Jackson, who came from a nearby town, took the case under his control. He immediately felt that this was no ordinary murder for money or jealousy. There was something in this phrase, "For your sins," written on the floor. It seemed to allude to a religious motif or an ancient grudge. He decided to start with Richard himself. Who was he really? Walker seemed like an upstanding citizen, but the more Jackson delved into his life, the more he uncovered hidden pages of the past. A few years ago, Walker was the main sponsor of the local church. However, few people knew that he had considerable influence on the decisions that were made within the community. During one of his meetings with Pastor Thomas, Jackson heard something strange. The pastor admitted that Walker tried to control not only the finances of the church, but also the community itself. He placed his people in key positions and influenced every decision made in the town. Over time, the detective learned even more. It turns out that a few years ago, another disappearance shook the town. A young girl, Sarah Carter, simply disappeared without a trace after she was seen near the church. She was one of those who worked for Walker, and before she disappeared, she said that she had something important to tell the police. Her disappearance remained unsolved. Jackson decided to investigate the connection between Walker and the missing girl. He soon found old records. Sarah Carter had an affair with Richard and probably knew more than she should. Jackson now understood. The murder of Walker was only the tip of the iceberg. Something deeper and darker was hiding behind this crime. While the detective gathered evidence, the city began to resemble a boiling cauldron. People remembered long-forgotten events and rumors. Everyone knew that the church in Mayfield was hiding its secrets. But who was ready to reveal the truth? And was Walker the only victim of this mysterious conspiracy? The answers were coming, but Jackson felt as if he was playing with fire that was ready to consume the whole town. Detective Jackson, realizing that he was approaching the core of the conspiracy, decided to investigate the connection between the church and the disappearance of Sarah Carter even deeper. He spent more time in the archives, where he found documents that showed financial deals between Walker and the church council. These records showed that a few years ago, when Sarah disappeared, the church had a large donation made to an anonymous account. The anonymous donor turned out to be not as secret as it seemed. It was Richard Walker. Jackson began to suspect that something sinister was lurking behind Walker's charity. He tracked down a former church counselor, old Joe Greenwood, who had resigned shortly after Sarah's disappearance. Joe was a lonely and reclusive man, but he agreed to meet the detective in his home, away from prying eyes. In the smoky room, Greenwood told a terrifying story. He admitted that for years the church was not only a place of prayer, but also an arena for a closed circle of influential people who used their connections for hidden agendas. Walker was the leader of this group. They controlled everything from local politics to business, and those who tried to reveal their secrets disappeared. According to Greenwood, Sarah Carter found out about some of these deals by accident. She threatened Walker that she would expose him if he did not confess himself. But instead of changing his life, Walker orchestrated her disappearance. Greenwood had heard that Sarah's body was hidden in the dungeon of the old part of the church, where only the chosen had access. Jackson, hearing this, realized that the matter had become dangerous. If this information comes to the surface, it can destroy not only the reputation of Walker, but also the entire church community. He decided to check the dungeon and find out if Sarah's body was really there. Late at night, the detective entered the church. Armed with a lantern, he made his way to an old door that led underground. The keys that Greenwood had given him came up, and a cold stone staircase opened before him. Down below it was dark and damp, and the air smelled of age-old mustiness. At the end of the corridor, Jackson discovered a small stone space that resembled an ancient crypt. An old icon hung on the wall, but it looked neglected and dirty. In the corner, he saw something wrapped in an old cloth. He came closer and lifted the cloth. It was a skeleton that had been hidden there for decades. This terrible moment confirmed the detective's suspicions. Sarah Carter's body had finally been found. But that was just the beginning. Now Jackson had even more questions. Who else was involved in this conspiracy? And what could await him if he continued to uncover the dark secrets of this city? The investigation continued, but the darkness that enveloped the town grew thicker and thicker. After the gruesome discovery in the church's basement, Jackson decided not to immediately publicize the discovery of the body. He knew that if the truth came to the surface prematurely, a wave of panic could engulf the city, and all those involved in the conspiracy would disappear or cover their tracks. The detective conducted a secret analysis of the skeleton in a private laboratory outside the city. The results were unequivocal. It was indeed Sarah Carter. Jackson understood that he now had complete proof of Walker's connection to the girl's disappearance. But who else was involved? Someone from the local people had to help him, and it was definitely not ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, unrest was growing in the town. The residents noticed that Jackson was investigating something, but he avoided any direct answers. And some influential people began to worry that their secrets might be exposed. One of them was Devin Scott, a wealthy businessman, an old friend of Walker, and another sponsor of the church. Scott sensed that the detective was getting closer to the truth and started his own game. Jackson decided to make an unexpected move. He met again with Anna Walker, Richard's widow. She looked even more distant and frightened, but her coldness began to crack as she spoke. She admitted that she knew about the dark affairs of her husband. Moreover, she said that in the last months before his death, Richard felt that he was being watched. He was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and was even going to leave the city, but did not have time. Anna remembered one interesting detail. On the day of the murder, Richard received a strange threatening letter from an anonymous address. She handed it to Jackson, and upon reading it, the detective saw a similarity in handwriting to the writing found on the floor of Walker's office for your sins. The letter contained another phrase, "Your blood is on the hands of others." This suggested that someone in Walker's inner circle had betrayed him. Jackson decided to focus on Walker's inner circle. Pastor Thomas, Devin Scott, and several other influential people in the town were all potential suspects. But the real key to the solution lay in the old criminal past of one of the council members, Paul Mason. Paul was an old friend of Walker's, and they had once worked together on suspicious cases in a neighboring state, but successfully avoided charges. The more Jackson dug, the clearer it became. Walker became a convenient scapegoat for someone. A close friend was using him as a front to cover up even bigger crimes, possibly even Sarah's murder itself. The pressure on Jackson grew. The unknown began to haunt him. Someone left threatening messages in his hotel room, and one evening his car was broken into. It became clear that the detective was in danger, and someone was ready to go to extreme measures to protect his secrets. Finally, the detective gathered all the key evidence and decided to act. He invited Paul Mason for questioning. During the conversation, Paul initially denied any involvement, but under pressure, made the fatal mistake of recalling details that only someone directly involved in Sarah's murder could know. This was the beginning of his downfall. But will Paul be the last link in the conspiracy? Or is there an even more dangerous leader behind him that Jackson has yet to reveal? Paul Mason broke down during interrogation. His attempts at justification were weak, and Jackson felt it was only a matter of time before he confessed. Paul said that he was part of a closed circle with Walker, Scott, and several other influential people in the city. This group secretly controlled businesses, political decisions, and even religious matters in Mayfield. They spent years withdrawing money through charitable projects, and Walker was a key figure in all the arrangements. However, the moment Sarah Carter started digging under Walker and disappeared, the situation got out of control. It was then that the circle began to fall apart, and each became suspicious of the other. Paul talked about secret meetings in church dungeons, where people's fates were decided. It turns out that it was Walker who orchestrated the hiding of Sarah's body to protect himself and his partners. But Walker began to lose control of the situation, and his partners realized that he could no longer protect them. Then the plan appeared, to use Volker as a victim and blame all dark affairs on him. Jackson now understood that the murder of Walker was not a spontaneous act, but a carefully planned operation. But who was behind this plan? Paul recalled that Walker began receiving threats after he tried to withdraw from the club. He could no longer bear the pressure and wanted to confess everything to the police, hoping for protection. But someone got ahead of him. The detective decided to focus on Devin Scott, a wealthy businessman who was considered by everyone to be a successful and decent citizen. He was one of the most influential figures in the town, and everyone knew that his word carried more weight than any decision in the town hall. Jackson felt that Scott played his game, and he was the key figure in this crime. The detective decided to meet with Scott under the pretext of a casual conversation about Walker, but he was sure that this would attract the attention of someone who was afraid of exposure. In the evening, at the very moment when Jackson was planning to prepare a search warrant for Scott's house, an unexpected event happened. Jackson got a call that someone was trying to break into his hotel room. He was given an anonymous message, "Your next detective." This hint was obvious. Someone in the conspiracy knew that Jackson was close to the solution. Frightened, but even more motivated, the detective decided to go all out and not stop. The next morning, he visited Davin Scott's home with a police team. During the search of Scott's house, the police found evidence: old documents about financial instruments, correspondence with Walker, and other members of the secret circle. However, the real shock was a video recording found in Scott's safe. It was a video taken in a church dungeon where members of the circle discussed the fate of Sarah Carter. The video showed Walker nervously asking the others to stop, but he was silenced. Jackson now had evidence that pointed not only to Scott's involvement, but also to other influential people in the city. The video showed that among them was Pastor Thomas, who tried his best to avoid the attention of the police during the investigation. But the most important thing that was visible in the video was how Devin Scott gave the order to kill Walker in order to get rid of the witness. Jackson realized that in front of him was not only a financial swindler, but the real mastermind of the whole conspiracy. However, the detective knew, when the web of betrayal began to unravel, the real danger was just approaching. Now Scott and his allies will do everything possible to destroy any evidence and eliminate Jackson himself. Time to play against him. Jackson knew that the videotape found in Scott's house was a crucial piece of evidence in the investigation. But now that he had come out against those who led the conspiracy, he himself was in danger. It felt like the whole system of this small town was riddled with conspiracy. He was like the only person challenging the old order, and now they were responding. Jackson's first step was to take the video and other evidence to the police station. But he knew Devin Scott wasn't going to sit idly by. So he decided to proceed cautiously and alerted only a few trusted colleagues to what he had found. Just in case, Jackson made several copies of the video, and one of them was given to a lawyer he trusted. The detective then contacted the prosecutor's office to obtain an arrest warrant for Devin Scott and Pastor Thomas. But before the process was complete, strange things began to happen. Jackson noticed that he was being followed, cars with tinted windows appearing in his field of vision wherever he was. In the hotel room where he lived, someone repeatedly tried to leave strange messages. "You will not live to see the trial." All this only confirmed that he was on the right track. One evening, on his way back to his temporary accommodation, Jackson narrowly avoided an accident when a truck suddenly pulled into his lane. It was no accident. Someone wanted to stop him at any cost, but Jackson was determined and wasn't going to back down. Meanwhile, rumors about Walker's arrest and a conspiracy around the church were spreading in the city. People began to ask questions and suspect those who had been at the head of the community for years. The atmosphere in the city was becoming tense. It felt like the chain of events was coming to a climax. Pastor Thomas tried to flee the city when he learned that the police had a warrant for him, but was apprehended on the outskirts. Scott, on the other hand, tried to do everything possible to use his connections and divert suspicion from himself. He began to buy influential people, tried to put pressure on the judicial system, but for the first time his resources were insufficient. Several people from the city council, previously associated with the conspiracy, began to speak, saving their own skins. When these people realized that they too could be accused, they began to reveal even more details about the activities of the secret circle. Jackson gathered a group of police and went to Scott's estate to finally put an end to this case. But Devin Scott wasn't ready to give up. When the police surrounded his house, he barricaded himself inside and tried to escape. Arming himself, he decided to resist to the end. The police engaged in a confrontation that turned into a short but intense shootout. Jackson made his way into the house through the back entrance and tried to detain Scott, but he wasn't about to surrender peacefully. During the fight, Scott wounded the detective, but Jackson managed to neutralize him and arrest him. Finally, he who had long stood at the head of the conspiracy and directed all the dark affairs was in handcuffs. With the evidence collected and the testimony of other members of the secret circle, the prosecution had a strong case against Devin Scott, Pastor Thomas, and several others who had manipulated the city for years. Jackson not only revealed the truth about the assassination of Sarah Carter and Richard Walker, but also exposed the web of corruption that engulfed Mayfield. Despite the physical and moral losses, Jackson won. His persistence and dedication led to the small town's dark secrets eventually becoming known. But he also understood that the city would now never be the same. Mayfield had gone through his cleansing of blood and betrayal, and now it was time to rebuild, and for those who remained, to build a new future on the ruins of the past.